Every second, something invisible flickers across your mind an image. A word, a feeling, and then it's gone. But where did it come from? For centuries, we've believed thoughts lived only inside the brain, born from electricity and memory. Yet the deeper science looks, the stranger the story becomes. Some researchers say thought might not begin in the brain at all, but in the rhythm of the body, the chemistry of the gut, or even the quantum fabric of reality itself. From the first spark of a neuron to the silence between ideas, this journey explores what thinking really is and whether our minds are truly ours, or just open windows to something far greater. It begins in silence, the kind that fills a darkened room when the body has surrendered to rest and the breathing has fallen into rhythm. But inside the skull, something stirs that never fully stops. For centuries, people believed that sleep was the shutting down of the mind, a kind of nightly death that released the soul to wander in dreams. And yet, in the early decades of the 20th century, as scientists began to attach wires and glass tubes to human heads, they found that stillness was an illusion. The mind did not sleep. It glowed faintly in waves and pulses, each one as unique as a fingerprint. In 1924, a young German psychiatrist named Hans Berger sat alone in his lab at the University of Vienna, surrounded by humming amplifiers, copper wires, and the faint smell of heated dust. He had been searching for a way to measure the invisible traffic between nerve cells. To prove that thought had a physical signature, the idea came to him after years of fascination with coincidences and mental connections, stories of twins who sensed each other's accidents or mothers who knew their children were in danger. Berger believed that maybe hidden within the body, there was a measurable current linking mind to mind. He began by placing delicate silver electrodes on the scalp of patients, sometimes even on his own head, amplifying the faint electrical whisper that came through. On sheets of paper, through ink pens that quivered with motion, he saw waves, slow, rhythmic ripples when the subject was calm, jagged peaks when they were alert. Those early traces were weak and inconsistent, and many dismissed them as mechanical noise, the vibration of the building or interference from the lights. But Berger persisted, refining the equipment until the patterns became clear enough to repeat. He called them electroencephalogram, or EEGs. And by the late 1920s, he had proven that the brain was never still. The sleeping mind was filled with motion, a low tide of electrical murmurs washing across the cortex. Each phase of rest had its own signature, a different rhythm that revealed when dreams began, when the body shifted, when consciousness dimmed but never vanished. Other researchers soon joined the effort, curious about what these waves might mean. In Vienna and London, medical teams began comparing the patterns of healthy volunteers to those of patients suffering from epilepsy, depression, or brain injury. They discovered that the brain's electricity changed not only with sleep, but also with emotion, pain, and memory. A thought was not a ghost, it was energy, traveling in measurable lines. By the mid-1930s, the images of those lines appeared in journals and lectures, narrow scrolls of paper that recorded the silent motion of the mind, each curve and crest representing billions of neurons working together like a vast electrical sea. To imagine it now, in the calm of a quiet evening, is to picture a sleeping child, eyes closed, body still. But within the brain, tiny storms move from one hemisphere to the other, forming patterns that repeat night after night. These waves are called alpha and beta, delta and theta. It's names given by scientists who needed some way to describe the invisible. They do not hum or shine, yet they are as real as heartbeat and breath. Every memory that surfaces in a dream, every sudden image or half-formed sentence that appears in the dark, rides upon those electrical ripples. In those early years, the equipment was crude. Wires were wrapped in cloth, amplifiers filled entire desks, and the paper rolls had to be watched by hand to keep the pens from jamming. But the wonder was immense. For the first time in history, humans could look at the living brain without cutting it open. They could see thought without asking for words. Hospitals began using EEGs to identify when patients were truly asleep, when anesthesia took hold, and later, when life itself had ended. A flat line on the paper meant the silence was final, As the decades passed, new colors and machines replaced the ink pens, but the essence remained the same. The faint flicker that Hans Berger saw in his recorder in 1924 became the starting point of modern neuroscience, the first visible proof that even in the deepest sleep, the human mind is alive with quiet fire. When we dream, when we imagine, when we drift into the edge of waking, that fire changes shape, but never disappears. Some researchers call it the background hum of awareness, the echo of everything we have learned, seen, or felt. What is remarkable is how this discovery changed not only science, but our sense of what it means to be alive. Before the EEG thought was something private and unknowable. Afterward, it became something that could be recorded, graphed, and studied. Yet the mystery only deepened. The lines on paper could show when the brain was active, but not why. They could reveal that a thought was happening, but not what it meant or where it began. Was it a spark born in the neurons themselves? Or a wave triggered by something deeper emotion, memory, or perhaps even something beyond matter? Hans Berger never fully solved that question. He continued his experiments quietly until his death in 1941. It's uncertain whether his machine had revealed the soul or merely its shadow. But every neuroscientist's sense has followed the same faint trail of light. He discovered a pulse in the darkness. Proof that even in the stillness of sleep, the human mind is never truly still. It flickers, fades, and returns again, a living current beneath the skin, whispering that somewhere inside the silence, thought is being born. Inside every human skull is a quiet thunderstorm that never ends. A landscape where billions of cells reach toward one another and trade flickers of light faster than any heartbeat could follow. Each neuron, small enough to fit on the tip of a needle, carries within it the potential to change a life. To spark an idea, to decide whether a memory is kept or lost. To the naked eye, it looks like nothing an invisible pulse hidden in tissue but under the right instruments. It reveals itself as a flash of electricity moving from one cell to the next, like lightning crawling through clouds of flesh. It is these tiny storms that shape what we call thought, emotion, and self. Though for most of human history, no one knew they existed. The ancient physicians believed the brain was a cold organ, a place of damp balance and quiet reason, while the heart burned with fire and passion. But centuries later, in the first half of the 20th century, scientists discovered that the brain's calm appearance hid an entire world of electrical storms, each spark both mechanical and alive. In 1939, two young researchers working along the English coast began one of the most important investigations in the history of biology. Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley had chosen a strange subject for their experiments, the giant axon of a squid. As thick as a pencil lead and long enough to connect the sea creature's head to its tentacles, the reason was simple. It was large enough to insert electrodes directly into something impossible with the tiny nerve fibers of humans or mice. Inside their small seaside laboratory in Plymouth, with waves crashing against the walls, the two men wired the living tissue to a circuit, connected it to an amplifier, and watched as the neuron came alive. When stimulated, it released a sharp burst of voltage, a sudden change from negative to positive and back again. This was the action potential, a pulse that traveled down the nerve like a wave of lightning, carrying messages through the body. What they found was not magic, but chemistry in motion. The neuron's outer skin, or membrane, was lined with microscopic gates that opened and closed in fractions of a second, allowing charged particles, sodium and potassium ions, to rush in and out. This movement created a difference in voltage, a tiny electric signal that leapt from one end of the cell to the other. It lasted only a thousandth of a second, but multiplied across the billions of neurons in a brain. It became a continuous symphony of pulses, each one marking the moment something was seen, remembered, or felt. Hodgkin and Huxley's discovery earned them the Nobel Prize in 1963. But in that moment in 1939, what they saw on the needle of the oscilloscope must have felt like catching thought itself in the act of being born. For the first time, the invisible was measurable. Scientists could now record the living code of the nervous system, seeing how a single neuron fired when a muscle twitched, when an eye moved, when a rat turned toward a sound. They learned that each neuron either fired or did not, that there was no half signaling, an on or off, a yes or no. It was a kind of digital language long before the computer age, and every human thought was written in that binary rhythm. But as simple as that pattern was, the way billions of these sparks interacted created something vastly more complex: emotion, memory, imagination. Over time, researchers discovered that the spark alone was not enough. Between one neuron and the next was a small gap called the synapse, and in that space, electricity turned into chemistry. When a pulse reached the end of a neuron, it triggered the release of microscopic packets filled with molecules neurotransmitters such as dopamine and acetylcholine. These chemicals crossed the gap, binding to receptors on the next neuron and either igniting or calming it. That moment, when a spark became a droplet of chemistry, was the bridge between thought and feeling, between a logical signal and an emotional experience. It meant that every memory, every decision, and every fear was not just an electrical pattern, but also a chemical state, shaped by the balance of substances that flooded through the brain's hidden ocean when scientists first watched these processes unfold under microscopes and glass electrodes. They described them with wonder, not just as experiments, but as living poetry. The firing of neurons in the visual cortex, for instance, was compared to a field of fireflies by neurophysiologist David Hubel in the 1950s, who recorded how individual cells responded to lines of light projected on a screen. Each cell seemed to recognize a pattern: a vertical bar, a corner, a movement like sentinels standing guard over perception. From such patterns, entire worlds were built in the mind. Smell, a song, a sudden memory, all were waves of electricity translated into sensation. Even now, nearly a century after Hodgkin and Huxley's first experiment, the metaphor of storms still fits. When we think our brains light up with millions of pulses per second, some paths fire repeatedly, strengthening the connections that form habits or memories, while others fade, forgotten like distant thunder. Sleep resets these networks, pruning unused branches, while new experiences carve fresh trails. Every decision, whether to move a hand, recall a name, or speak a word, arises from the delicate timing of these flashes. To imagine the scale of it is almost impossible. When 1 cubic millimeter of brain tissue, smaller than a grain of rice, there can be more connections than there are stars visible in the night sky. And all of them operate silently, with currents measured in millivolts, flickering in sequences that no human eye could follow. Yet together, they give rise to thought, the most private and fragile phenomenon we know. A single neuron firing may mean nothing, but 100,000 firing in harmony can create a sentence, a picture, a feeling of love or fear. In the end, the brain's electricity is not merely power, it is identity. When a neuron fires, it does not just transmit data, it participates in who we are at that instant. The storms inside us shape the rhythm of our moods, the texture of our memories, the tone of our dreams. The discovery of the action potential revealed that what we call mind is not something that floats above the body, but something that burns within it. And though the sparks are tiny and brief, they are countless, overlapping and alive and endless. Storm that turns the silence of biology into the music of being. In a small room in Madrid in the late 1800s, a man sat by candlelight surrounded by glass slides, ink, and the faint smell of chemicals. His name was Santiago Ramon y Cajal, a Spanish doctor who would one day be called the father of modern neuroscience, though at that moment he was simply a man staring into a microscope, trying to make sense of a world too small to see with the naked eye. On his slides were thin slices of brain tissue stained with silver nitrate, a technique first developed by the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi. It was a strange process, unpredictable and slow, but when it worked, the silver would seep into only a few neurons, leaving the rest clear like lightning bolts frozen in glass. Kyle used this imperfect method to his advantage, sketching what he saw with remarkable precision. Under his hand, the brain began to reveal itself not as a smooth mass, but as a vast forest of branching trees, each one reaching toward the others without ever quite touching. Night after night, Kyle traced those shapes by candlelight, his eyes aching, his fingers stained with ink, filling hundreds of notebooks with drawings that looked more like art than science. In 1891, he proposed something radical: that the brain was not a single continuous network as most believed, but a collection of individual cells communicating across tiny gaps. Each neuron was separate, yet together they formed an immense and living web. This became known as the neuron doctrine, and it changed everything. Before Kyle, scientists had imagined the brain as one seamless structure, like a sponge or a lump of clay through which signals somehow flowed. After him, the brain became a society of billions, each cell alive with its own purpose, each sending and receiving messages through delicate contact points that he called synapses. Kyle often described neurons as the mysterious butterflies of the soul, a poetic phrase that revealed how deeply he saw the beauty in their design. He knew that a single neuron by itself meant little. It could spark or rest, but it could not think. Meaning, memory, and self were born from the connections between them, from the intricate paths that joined one lightning flash to another. It was in these connections that the real language of the brain began to take shape, a silent conversation written in patterns of light and timing rather than words or sound. The number of possible combinations was beyond imagination. In a single human brain, there are an estimated 86 billion neurons, and each one can form thousands of connections. The number of potential pathways exceeds the number of stars in the Milky Way. When Kyle published his drawings in 1906, the same year he shared the Nobel Prize with Golgi, the world of science began to understand that the mind was not a simple machine, but a universe of interwoven signals. Golgi himself disagreed with Kyle's conclusion, believing instead that the brain was a single continuous structure, and their debate echoed through laboratories for decades. Yet with time, new methods of imaging confirmed Kyle's vision. Neurons were distinct, and their strength came not from being identical, but from their ability to link and communicate. These links formed patterns that shifted and rewired themselves as people learned, dreamed, or remembered. Years later, with the invention of powerful microscopes and computer modeling, scientists began to chase an even grander dream: to map all those connections, to draw the brain's entire wiring diagram. They called it the connectome, from the word genome, the map of genes. Just as the genome describes what makes life grow, the connectome might one day reveal what makes thought flow. It is a map of the highways and crossroads that define our minds, a way to see how a memory travels, how a fear is learned, or how a song loops in our head long after it has stopped playing. The effort to build such a map began seriously in the early 2000s, with projects at places like MIT and the University of Cambridge, where researchers used beams of electrons and powerful computers to trace the paths of neurons through animal brains, one microscopic image at a time. It is slow, patient work, not unlike Kyle's long nights at the microscope. Though now, the candlelight has been replaced by the hum of machines. Even with all this progress, the connectome remains incomplete. The human brain's network is so vast that no computer on Earth can yet hold it in full. But partial maps have begun to reveal its strange logic. They show that thought does not move in straight lines but in loops and echoes, that some pathways form shortcuts between distant regions, and that memories are stored not in one place but in patterns spread across the entire web. These findings have begun to explain why damage to one part of the brain can sometimes be overcome, because the network can reroute itself, finding new paths around broken links. It also explains why no two minds are exactly alike. Each person's connectome is slightly different, shaped by life experience, memory, and emotion. Every joy, every loss, every sound we have ever heard leaves behind a small shift in that wiring, a trace that subtly changes the way we see the world. What Kyle could not have imagined is how closely his hand-drawn sketches would resemble the digital images of the 21st century. The branching neurons he saw under his microscope now appear in glowing colors on computer screens, mapped by lasers and electrons. Their connections forming something that looks almost cosmic-like, a cluster of galaxies suspended in space. And in a way, that comparison is fitting. For if the universe is made of stars and gravity, the mind is made of neurons and connection. each forming constellations of memory, imagination, and will. When we think, when we recall a childhood scent or recognize a face in a crowd, we are tracing paths across that internal galaxy. Following signals that fire and fade in perfect rhythm, we are, without realizing it, speaking the language that Kyle first glimpsed in silver and Inca language written in light, born in silence and alive in every one of us. And though the full translation of that language may still be centuries away, its beauty remains unchanged. Countless small voices speaking together, forming the single, endless sentence that is a human mind. By the middle of the 20th century, science had already learned to listen to the brain's electrical whispers through the EEG, but no one had yet managed to see what thinking looked like. For all their instruments and equations, the inner world of the mind remained hidden behind bone and silence. Then, in the 1950s, a group of physicists and doctors began working with radioactive tracers, tiny particles that could move through blood and emit faint flashes detectable by special cameras. The first experiments were cautious and crude, involving heavy equipment, long exposures, and subjects who had to lie perfectly still for hours. But the results were extraordinary. For the first time, the living brain was no longer an invisible mystery, it was an image, flickering and alive. One of the early pioneers was a man named George de Hevesy, a Hungarian chemist whose work on radioisotopes had already earned him a Nobel Prize in 1943. His techniques made it possible to trace the movement of substances inside living tissue, following how they were absorbed, distributed, and transformed. These methods were soon adopted by neurologists who wanted to understand how blood and energy flowed through the brain. In the 1950s, scientists at Massachusetts General Hospital and at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden began to inject minute doses of radioactive compounds into patients and measure how they traveled through the brain's network of vessels. On grainy film, points of light began to appear and shift, showing which regions consumed the most energy. Areas active during problem-solving or speech seemed to glow more brightly than others. Thought, once only guessed at, now left a visible trace. It was not yet a perfect picture. The early scanners could not show fine detail, and the exposure times were long enough that a person's small movement could blur everything. Still, the sight of a mind lighting up during a task astonished even the most skeptical researchers. They began to realize that thinking was not something that happened everywhere in the brain at once, but rather in patterns and pulses. Different regions spoke to each other like instruments in an orchestra, each contributing a unique tone to the melody of consciousness. The occipital lobe flared when someone looked at a shape. The auditory cortex shimmered when they heard a sound, and the frontal regions brightened when they made a decision. By the late 1970s, the technology evolved into something far more precise: the positron emission tomography scan, or PET. This system used positrons, the antiparticles of electrons, to create detailed images of the brain's chemical activity. Patients would breathe or drink a solution containing a radioactive tracer, often a form of glucose, labeled with fluorinadium as their neurons consumed it. The scanner would detect the radiation released. What appeared on screen was a kind of moving map of metabolism, with red and yellow regions indicating areas of high activity and cooler blues marking quiet zones. For the first time, scientists could watch a thought travel through the brain in real time. Following its route as it passed from vision to language to memory, these early scans revealed something humbling: that the brain is not simply on or off, but constantly shifting between states, even during rest. Even when people lay motionless, areas of the brain continued to pulse with energy. It was as if the mind, left to itself, wandered through its own corridors, replaying memories, simulating futures, and composing silent conversations. This discovery would later be known as the default mode network, a pattern of background activity that never quite stops. In the 1990s, the arrival of functional magnetic resonance imaging flash MRI changed the landscape once again. Unlike PET scans, which relied on radioactive tracers, fMRI used magnetic fields and radio waves to measure subtle changes in blood oxygen levels. When neurons became active, they consumed more oxygen, and that tiny shift could be captured as a signal. The result was a series of glowing images, updating every few seconds, showing thought as color and motion. A person could lie inside the scanner and simply imagine moving their hand, and a corresponding region of their motor cortex would light up like a sunrise. The first fMRI images were grainy and slow, but they carried a sense of wonder that no other scientific picture could match. For the first time, researchers could see imagination itself flicker on a screen. The boundaries between psychology and biology began to blur. Questions that had once belonged to philosophy. What is emotion? Where does love reside? What happens when we recall a childhood face were now addressed with images and data? By the early 2000s, entire fields of study had grown around this technology. Cognitive neuroscience, neuroeconomics, affective science. Laboratories filled with students and machines hum quietly as people are shown words, faces, or memories, while scanners record the patterns of their thoughts. Yet, for all the colors and shapes these machines can produce, the truth remains fragile. The images are not direct photographs of thought, they are indirect signals. Averages of blood flow and magnetic change processed through layers of mathematics. A glowing region on a scan does not mean a single thought lives there. It is only a sign that somewhere in that area, millions of neurons are working harder than usual. Many of the famous brain maps, the spots labeled fear, love, music, or language, are simplifications, useful but incomplete. The brain's dialogue is more intricate than any static image can show. Sometimes, when a subject breathes unevenly or moves their eyes, the scan creates false activity. When algorithms are adjusted slightly, entire discoveries vanish. Scientists call this the fragility of the signal, the reminder that behind every beautiful image lies uncertainty. Still, there is a kind of poetry in these imperfections. The moving color maps, with their slow pulses and glowing edges, remind us that the brain is not a machine with fixed parts, but a living field of shifting light. Every frame captures only a single instant of a much larger rhythm, one that began long before birth and will end only with the final quieting of the neurons. So when we look at a brain on film, we're not seeing a complete story. We are catching a reflection, a brief shimmer of what it means to think. The rest, the meaning, the awareness, the self that looks back at its own image remains beyond the reach of any lens. But still, the effort continues. With every scan, every flicker of color, we move one frame closer to understanding the strange, luminous language of thought itself, long before microscopes, electrodes, or scanners existed. The search for where thought begins was carried out by candlelight and intuition. People looked inward and imagined that the mind must live where they felt the strongest sensations in the chest, where the heart thudded against the ribs, or in the breath, which vanished when life ended. In the ancient world, the brain was rarely seen as important. The Egyptians, skilled in the art of preservation, removed the brain through the nose during mummification, stirring and discarding it as waste, yet they left the heart untouched in the chest. Believing it to be the center of intelligence and emotion, the heart, warm and restless, seemed alive. The brain, pale and silent, appeared dead. For them, the truth was self-evident. Feeling was in the heart, because that was where pain, joy, and fear could be felt most sharply. When Aristotle wrote about the soul in the 4th century BCE, he agreed with the Egyptians more than he could have known. He described the brain as a cooling organ, a mechanism for tempering the fiery passions that rose from the heart. To him, the heart was the seat of sensation, memory, and thought. While the brain's purpose was to moderate the heat of emotion, much like a damp sponge absorbing excess flame, this idea persisted for centuries, carried by the weight of his reputation, and repeated in the manuscripts of later scholars. It seemed reasonable at the time because when someone died, the pulse stopped first. Not the quiet organ hidden within the skull, but not all thinkers agreed. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek physician Alcmaeon of Croton proposed that the brain was the source of understanding, suggesting that the senses connected to it through hidden channels. Hippocrates, writing a century later, went even further. declaring that from the brain and the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and sorrows. Yet his words were largely forgotten or ignored, replaced by the more poetic image of the heart as the vessel of the soul. The debate continued through Rome and into the Middle Ages. As philosophers and physicians dissected animals and prayed over bodies, each searching for the origin of thought, each certain it must be somewhere that could be touched by the 17th century. When René Descartes sat in his study in the Netherlands and wrote about the separation of body and mind, the question had become both scientific and spiritual. Descartes, trained in mathematics and anatomy, believed that the soul interacted with the body through a tiny structure deep within the brain called the pineal gland. To him, this single organ, small enough to balance on a fingertip, was the seat of consciousness, the place where the immaterial mind met the material world. He was fascinated by its symmetry, noting that, unlike other brain structures, it stood alone at the center, as if placed there on purpose. The theory was elegant and impossible to prove, yet it shaped European thought for generations. The pineal gland became a symbol of mystery, a bridge between the visible and invisible realms, even as microscopes revealed new details of anatomy. The language of spirit lingered. 17th and 18th century anatomists still spoke of vital fluids and animal spirits moving through hollow nerves, as if thought were a wind that could be bottled. The Italian scientist Luigi Galvani changed that image forever in the 1780s, and he touched a metal scalpel to the leg of a dead frog and saw it twitch. He realized that the cause was not spirit, but electricity of force that could travel through nerves and animate muscle. His discovery startled Europe. For the first time, life and movement seemed to obey the same laws as lightning and magnetism. Galvani's experiments inspired decades of fascination, from laboratory studies to the Gothic imagination of writers like Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein in 1818, as electricity itself became the symbol of life's spark. The idea that the brain was an electrical organ slowly took hold. In the early 1800s, Alessandro Volta and later Michael Faraday explored how currents move through materials, while German physiologists like Emil du Bois-Reymond and Hermann von Helmholtz began measuring the speed of nerve impulses. They discovered that messages in the body traveled not instantly, but at a measurable pace, around 100 feet per second, proving that thought and sensation were physical processes, not mystical ones. By the end of the 19th century, scientists knew that the brain was made up of cells that used electrical signals to communicate. Though no one yet understood how those signals became emotion, language, or memory, the shift from divine breath to electricity and salt water was not sudden. It was a slow unweaving of centuries of belief, a gradual replacement of metaphor with measurement. The heart lost its throne, but it did not lose its poetry. People still spoke of heartbreak, courage, and compassion, as if the chest contained the soul. Yet in laboratories, the evidence pointed elsewhere. When electrodes were placed on the scalp, faint pulses appeared. When chemical salts were added to isolated nerves, the signals changed. The human mind, it turned out, was not guided by spirits or celestial fire, but by ion sodium and potassium drifting through microscopic gates in the membranes of neurons. It is easy now to look back and smile at the old. It is the Egyptian embalmers discarding the brain as useless, Aristotle calling it a cooling device, Descartes placing the soul in a gland the size of a pea butt. Those errors were necessary steps toward understanding. They were attempts to describe mystery with the tools and language of their time. Even today, when scientists can watch thought move in color on a screen, the ancient impulse remains, to find the exact place where the invisible becomes real. We no longer speak of divine breath, yet the question that haunted the philosophers still lingers. What is this current that flickers within us, this electricity shaped by memory and salt water? We know how it moves, how it fires, how it fades, but the old wonder persists. The sense that in every pulse of the brain there might still be an echo of the ancient mind, whispering that the soul, whatever it is, has simply changed its language. In the middle of the 20th century, As televisions flickered in living rooms and rockets began to reach for the edge of the atmosphere, another revolution was taking place in rooms that were almost perfectly still. These were the sleep laboratories of the 1960s. Small and dimly lit chambers lined with wires, paper rolls, and humming machines. Inside them, volunteers lay on narrow beds while scientists watched their closed eyes and listened to the quiet rhythm of their breathing. It might have looked like an experiment in boredom, but what those researchers were studying would change the understanding of the human mind forever. They were searching for what happens when consciousness lets go. When the waking world fades and the brain begins to dream. Before this period, sleep had been seen as a simple shutting down, a passive state where the mind drifted into silence and the body repaired itself. But when scientists like Eugenia Sarinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago began attaching electrodes to the scalps of sleeping subjects in the early 1950s, they found that the night was far from silent. In 1953, A. Sarinsky noticed that during certain periods of the night, a sleeper's eyes darted rapidly beneath their lids. Their heart rate quickened and their breathing grew shallow, even though their muscles remained almost completely still. When he awoke the subjects during these strange episodes, they reported vivid dreams filled with color, movement, and emotion. This was the birth of REM sleep. Rapid eye movement tandem marked the discovery that the dreaming mind was as alive and busy as the waking one. By the early 1960s, entire laboratories were devoted to charting this new terrain. Technicians sat through the night surrounded by oscillographs and amplifiers, their coffee cooling beside the glowing dials. Every flicker on the EEG paper represented the activity of millions of neurons firing together. And during REM periods, those traces erupted into wild, irregular patterns that looked almost identical to wakefulness. It was as if the mind, freed from the body's limits, had slipped into another kind of life, a world without gravity or consequence, where thoughts could take form and dissolve without ever being seen. Scientists began to realize that dreams were not the product of idle imagination, but the natural expression of the brain's restless circuits, a nightly rehearsal for consciousness itself. What made these findings even stranger was how the body cooperated in the illusion. During REM sleep, the brainstem sends signals that paralyze most voluntary muscles, preventing dreamers from acting out their visions. This phenomenon, called atonia, was first described in detail by Michel Jouvet, a French neuroscientist working in Lyon in the 1960s. He called REM sleep paradoxical sleep because the brain was awake in every way except awareness. Cats in his lab twitched their whiskers and paws during REM as if chasing something in their dreams. But when Jouvet disabled the part of the brain that induced paralysis, they leaped and moved violently, enacting whatever they were seeing in their minds. This discovery suggested that dreams were not abstract. After all, they were deeply physical experiences, driven by the same neural machinery that controlled action, perception, and emotion in waking life. As more laboratories joined the study of sleep, new questions arose. Why was the dreaming brain so active when the body was completely at rest? Some believed that dreams were a kind of mental housekeeping, clearing away unused memories to make room for the new. Others saw them as emotional therapy, the mind's attempt to process what it could not face during the day. Harvard psychiatrist Alan Hobson proposed in the 1970s that dreams were the result of random bursts of activity from the brainstem, with the higher cortex struggling to make sense of the noise by turning it into a story. Yet, even as these theories multiplied, the mystery only deepened. Because the images people reported were too vivid, too structured, and too often tied to real fears and desires to be dismissed as random sparks, to watch a sleeper in REM is to see contradiction made visible. The eyelids flutter, the pulse races, yet the person lies motionless, locked within their private cinema. The electrical patterns recorded from the brain look indistinguishable from those of someone awake and thinking. It is as if the border between dreaming and waking is only a thin membrane that shifts back and forth each night. Some researchers began to wonder whether dreaming might be the default mode of the mind, with waking consciousness being merely the version tuned to the outside world. The dream, in that view, was not an escape from reality, but a parallel stream of experience, built from the same material, memory, emotion, and sensory fragments rearranged in endless combinations. By the late 1960s, the idea of mapping the dream state had spread beyond neuroscience into art, psychology, and even politics. Sleep labs began to attract not only scientists, but poets and philosophers who saw in REM the evidence of something timeless, the meeting point of reason and imagination. Some patients, trained to recognize that they were dreaming without waking, achieved lucid dreams and described the sensation of flying or reshaping their surroundings with pure intention. Their EEGs showed the same signature bursts of activity, suggesting that awareness itself could exist inside a dream, flickering like a candle behind closed eyes. The thin line between dream imagery and waking thought has never been fully drawn. Every night, the brain builds entire worlds from scraps of memory and imagination, then dismantles them before morning. Sometimes the fragments linger a song, a face, a feeling of falling, and they fade only as daylight strengthens. Neuroscientists now know that the same networks responsible for dreaming are active when we daydream or imagine, meaning that even in the middle of the day, pieces of the dream machine are still running beneath the surface. The difference between a vision and a thought may simply be a matter of degree, of how tightly the senses are tied to reality at any given moment. To lie in a dark room and drift towards sleep is to approach that invisible border. The body slows, the temperature drops, and the noise of the day recedes until what remains is the quiet rhythm of the heart and the flickering of unseen lightning within the skull. Somewhere beyond that stillness, the mind begins to dream again, restless, creative, electric. The same machine that plans and remembers, that reasons and doubts, now paints with color and emotion instead of logic and speech. It is the oldest theater, one that opens every night, where the brain performs for itself, telling stories no one else will ever see, and proving again and again. That thought does not sleep, it only changes shape. There are moments when the brain, that careful conductor of thoughts and memories, suddenly breaks its own rhythm and erupts into a storm. The ancients had no instruments to record it, but they saw its power and named it sacred. The Greeks called epilepsy the sacred disease, believing it to be a visitation from the gods, a flash of the divine seizing a mortal mind. To them, the convulsions, the blank eyes, the trembling body, and the strange clarity that sometimes followed were signs that something beyond human understanding had touched the person. Centuries later, when medicine learned to watch the brain's electrical tides, the language changed, but the wonder did not. The sacred became scientific, but the mystery remained, a sudden surge of electricity spreading through the cortex like lightning across a summer sky, flooding every pathway at once. In that storm, consciousness wavered, fractured, or sometimes expanded in ways no one could fully explain among those who lived within that strange border. Between brilliance and chaos were artists, and writers whose works seemed to carry the same electric intensity as the storms inside their skulls. Vincent van Gogh, for instance, spent much of his life chasing moments of color so vivid they seemed to burn. In letters to his brother Theo, he describes sudden spells of exhaustion and confusion, followed by bursts of creative energy that left him painting feverishly for hours. Many historians now believe that Van Gogh suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that causes seizures not of the body but of perception and emotion. During these episodes, the world could shimmer with exaggerated brightness. Sounds could take on texture, and time itself could stretch or collapse. In 1889, while staying at the asylum in Saint-Remy, de Provence, he painted the starry night sky swirling with motion, full of restless rhythm. It was as if the same turbulence that troubled his mind had found its expression in the canvas. Turning suffering into light, Fyodor Dostoevsky, writing decades earlier in Russia, described something similar in words rather than paint. He too lived with epilepsy, and he spoke of moments before a seizure, when everything became unbearably beautiful, when he felt a sudden rush of clarity and peace. He called it the ecstatic aura, a fleeting second in which the universe made perfect sense, before the body collapsed and darkness swept in. In his novel The Idiot, the character Prince Mishkin experiences such a revelation, describing it as an instant where time stops and the soul sees eternity. Doctors later recognized that this aura was the first spark of abnormal electrical activity in the temporal lobe, spreading outward until it overwhelmed the brain. But to those who lived through it, it felt like a glimpse into something profound, a moment of absolute truth before the fall. In the 1930s, scientists began to study these strange experiences more carefully. At the Montreal Neurological Institute, a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield performed operations on patients with severe epilepsy, keeping them awake under local anesthesia so he could pinpoint the source of their seizures. With a thin electrode, he touched the surface of the brain, asking the patients what they felt. When he stimulated certain regions of the temporal lobe, they reported hearing music, smelling perfume, or reliving old memories as if time had folded back on itself. Some heard voices speaking from the past. Others saw flashes of light or faces. It was as though hidden corridors of memory could be opened with a single spark of electricity. Penfield concluded that the brain stored its experiences in intricate networks, and that the same circuits responsible for thought could, when disturbed, unleash chaos that felt like revelation. As researchers mapped more of the brain, they noticed that seizures often began in the same regions involved in creativity and emotion. The limbic system and temporal lobes, these areas were rich with connections between sensory input and meaning. The places where a sound becomes music, where a color becomes a feeling. When they fired too quickly or without order, they flooded the mind with sensations it could not interpret, creating a cascade of hallucination and insight. A single misfiring cell could ignite thousands more, setting off a wave of synchronized activity that raced through the cortex like fire through dry grass. The EE recordings showed jagged peaks, rhythmic bursts that echoed the flicker of lightning, confirming that thought and seizure were indeed born from the same electrical soil. Even now, patients describe experiences that defy simple language. A woman from London once told her doctors that seconds before her seizures, she saw golden shapes blooming in her vision, spiraling like flowers. A musician in Chicago reported that each episode began with a chord, always the same, 3 notes, D, F, and arising like a warning. Others speak of sense, a sudden rush of familiarity, or an overwhelming sense that something immense and unseen is about to happen. For them, the moment before the storm is as haunting as the storm itself, a threshold between order and surrender. What fascinated scientists most was how the same machinery that produced imagination and language could, under pressure, turn against itself and create distortion. It suggested that the line between creation and destruction in the brain is thin, that the forces which allow us to compose music, paint landscapes, or write novels are the same ones that, when overcharged, can shatter the sense of self. The storm in the skull is not entirely an intruder. It is a reflection of the brain's own design, its constant balance between excitation and control. In modern clinics, epilepsy is no longer seen as divine or mysterious, but as a condition of misfiring circuits, treatable with medication or surgery. Yet even as science tames the storm, its echoes remain in art and memory. The connection between chaos and creation still captivates us, the idea that out of sudden disorder might come something luminous, something human. When Van Gogh painted his spiraling skies or Dostoevsky wrote of a man who saw eternity in a heartbeat, they were describing what the EEG could only hint at, that the same current capable of breaking consciousness can also illuminate it. And so, the storm continues. Hidden within the skull, both danger and muse, shaping the way we dream, create, and understand what it means to be alive in a mind made of electricity. In the 1960s, at a small laboratory in California, a quiet revolution began inside the human skull. Surgeons and neuroscientists, working together in a blend of medicine and curiosity, were performing operations that seemed both daring and desperate. Their patients suffered from severe epilepsy, the kind that left them unconscious for minutes or hours. Their bodies seized by electrical storms that no drug could contain. The only option left was surgical, a procedure that involved cutting the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. It was meant purely as a treatment, a way to keep seizures from spreading from one side to the other. Yet it would soon open a window into the deepest mystery of all. The unity of the human mind. The corpus callosum is a bridge of over 200 million axons, a river of communication that allows the left and right hemispheres to share information almost instantly. When it was severed, doctors expected the patient to lose some coordination or perhaps memory, but to everyone's surprise, most people who underwent the procedure seemed almost normal afterward. They could talk, walk, and reason as before, as if nothing had changed. But when researchers began to design specific tests to examine how each hemisphere worked on its own, a strange and unsettling picture began to form. One in which two separate streams of consciousness lived within a single skull, each aware of different things, each capable of independent thought. Dr. Roger Sperry, along with his young graduate student Michael Gazzaniga, led many of these experiments at the California Institute of Technology. In their laboratory, they devised clever ways to send information to only one half of a patient's brain at a time. Because the visual system is divided, what the right eye sees is processed by the left hemisphere, and what the left eye sees by the right, they could show an image to one side of the brain while keeping it hidden from the other. When they flashed the word key to the patient's right visual field, the left hemisphere, which controls language, allowed the person to say the word aloud. But when they showed the same word to the left visual field, the right hemisphere saw it, and the patient said they saw nothing at all. Yet, when asked to reach under a screen with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, they could correctly pick up a key. What this meant was astonishing. The patient's left hemisphere could speak, but did not know what the right hemisphere had seen.
Wow.
While the right hemisphere could act, but could not speak. Within the same person, two different forms of knowledge existed, one verbal, one silent, both real. Sperry and Gazzaniga realized that the surgery had not merely divided the brain's anatomy. It had divided awareness itself. Each half of the brain was conscious in its own way, capable of perceiving, remembering, and even making decisions. It was as if two minds were living side by side, sharing the same body yet unable to fully communicate. The more they tested, the stranger it became. In one experiment, they showed an image of a snow scene to the right hemisphere and a picture of a chicken claw to the left. When asked to choose matching objects from a group of pictures, the right hand controlled by the left hemisphere pointed to a chicken, while the left hand guided by the right hemisphere chose a shovel. When asked to explain the choices, the patient, speaking half unaware of the snow image, quickly invented a reason, saying, "The chicken goes with the claw, and you need the shovel to clean out the chicken shed." This tendency of the left hemisphere to create explanations even when it lacked the full picture led Gazzaniga to call it the interpreter. It seemed that one part of the mind was constantly weaving a story to maintain a sense of unity. Refusing to admit that half of its world was missing, the implications were profound. Until then, consciousness had been treated as a single, unbroken phenomenon, one person, one mind. The split-brain studies showed that this unity might be an illusion, a delicate harmony maintained by constant communication between the hemispheres. When that bridge was cut, the illusion faltered, revealing something far more complex, a brain that contained multiple centers of awareness, each with its own personality and desires. Patients sometimes found their left hand acting against their will, buttoning a shirt that the right hand had just unbuttoned, or reaching for an object they were trying to avoid. It was as though one half of the self rebelled against the other, performing small acts of disobedience that hinted at independent intention. Sperry's research earned him the Nobel Prize in 1981. But even as he accepted it, he admitted that the full meaning of what they had uncovered was beyond him. What does it mean for a person to have two minds? Which one is the real self, the one that speaks or the one that knows but cannot speak? And if both are aware, where does unity come from? These questions unsettled scientists and philosophers alike. Some argued that the conscious eye is not a single entity but a collaboration between hemispheres, constantly negotiating agreement. Others suggested that our sense of self might be little more than a story told by the speaking half, a kind of internal narrator piecing together fragments of experience into a seamless whole. Decades later, Brain imaging has confirmed that even in ordinary, uninjured brains, the hemispheres specialize in different tasks. The left tends toward language, analysis, and sequence. The right toward imagery, intuition, and emotion. Together, they create balance. But apart, they reveal the dual nature of thought itself, its structure to create a structured and fluid. The split-brain patients taught humanity that the self is not a singular flame, but a pair of lanterns burning side by side. Their light overlapping just enough to appear as one to this day. Those early films and transcripts from Sperry's laboratory remain haunting. The calm voices of the patients describing things they cannot possibly see, the hands performing actions they cannot explain. The eerie realization that consciousness can divide and still function, all of it challenges the notion of individuality. Somewhere between those hemispheres lies the fragile thread that holds our sense of being whole. It is a reminder that the mind, for all its unity, is stitched together from many currents, and that beneath every sentence we speak, there may be another voice, silent and watching, carrying on its own quiet conversation in the dark. In the early years of the 21st century, in a small hospital room in Massachusetts, a young man named Matthew Nagel lay almost completely still. Unable to move or speak after a stabbing injury had left him paralyzed from the neck down, he was 25 years old. A former high school athlete who had once played football and spent his evenings surrounded by friends. But after the attack, his world had shrunk to the space of a bed and the quiet hum of machines. His body was motionless, but his mind was untouched, still alive with movement and memory. Doctors and engineers working with him wondered whether there might be a way to bridge that distance, to let a thought escape the body and become action again. Out of that question came one of the most extraordinary experiments of modern neuroscience, a project known as BrainGate. The idea behind BrainGate was simple in theory, but immensely difficult in practice: to place a tiny grid of electrodes directly on the surface of the motor cortex, the region of the brain that plans and controls movement, and to record the patterns of electrical activity that occurred when the person imagined moving a limb. Those patterns, once decoded by a computer, could be translated into commands for an external device, a cursor on a screen, a robotic arm, even a wheelchair. In other words, the brain itself would become the controller, bypassing the broken pathways of the spinal cord. What had once been science fiction was slowly taking shape in the hands of engineers, surgeons, and neuroscientists who believed that communication could be restored through pure thought. In 2004, Nagel became the first human being to have the BrainGate array implanted. The device was no larger than a baby aspirin, yet it contained 100 microscopic electrodes that could detect the firing of individual neurons. Neurosurgeon Gerhard Fries performed the surgery at Rhode Island Hospital, carefully placing the array into the region of Nagel's cortex responsible for hand and arm movement. When the operation was complete, the small connector that linked the array to a computer protruded from his skull, looking almost alien, but it was the link between his silent mind and the world outside. A few weeks later, the first trials began. Sitting in his hospital bed, Nagel stared at a computer monitor as researchers asked him to imagine moving a cursor toward a target. He could not move his actual hand, but as he thought about the action, visualizing, his fingers pressing or his wrists turning, the neurons in his motor cortex fired in familiar patterns, and the computer translated them into motion on the screen. The cursor moved. Slowly, hesitantly, but undeniably, it obeyed his thought. Over the following weeks, he learned to control it more precisely, to open and close on-screen programs, to draw simple shapes, and even to play a rudimentary video game. Later, he managed to use his thoughts to control a television and move a prosthetic arm. For the first time since his injury, could act upon the world again. The sight of it, the small flicker of motion on the monitor following, his intention was enough to move the research team to silence. It meant that the mind could communicate without the body, that thoughts could be harnessed and translated into something measurable, visible, and useful. This was not telepathy or mysticism. It was the physics of biology turned into language. Every neuron that fired produced a faint electrical signal, and the BrainGate system, listened to those signals, separating the noise from the pattern until it found the shape of intent. The technology that allowed this was the result of decades of groundwork. In the 1960s, experiments with cats and monkeys had already shown that the brain's motor regions could be decoded to predict movement. But it was not until the 1990s that computing power and materials science advanced enough to make human trials possible. Researchers at Brown University, led by neuroscientist John Donahue, built the first practical arrays capable of recording multiple neurons simultaneously without damaging tissue. They dreamed of restoring movement to people with spinal cord injuries, of giving speech back to those who had lost it to disease. Nagel's participation turned that dream into reality, even if only for brief moments at a time. What made his case remarkable was not only the technology, but the revelation it carried about what a thought truly is. When we imagine moving a hand, the same neurons activate as when we actually do. The difference is only that the signal never reaches the muscles. The body is not the origin of movement, it is the recipient. The command begins in the cortex, in faint bursts of electricity that travel outward through the nerves. By capturing those bursts directly, the researchers had shown that the boundary between thought and action could be crossed. The mind could reach beyond its flesh, using metal and code as its new limbs. In the years that followed, other patients joined the trials. One woman used her implant to control a robotic arm that could grasp a coffee cup and bring it to her lips. Another, paralyzed by ALS, learned to type by focusing on letters that appeared on a screen, forming words with nothing but concentration. The devices improved, becoming wireless, smaller, and safer. Engineers began to design systems that could not only read brain signals but also send information back, allowing users to feel touch through sensors on artificial fingers. Each step blurred the line between human and machine a little further, suggesting that identity might one day extend into the circuits that serve us. Yet even as the achievements grew, the mystery deepened. Watching a thought become motion was inspiring, but it raised unsettling questions. If a machine can read intention, where does privacy end? If the mind can move objects without muscles, what does it mean to inhabit a body at all? For the scientists, these were not philosophical puzzles, but the natural horizon of discovery. They knew that every new experiment pushed humanity closer to understanding its own machinery, to seeing thought not as an invisible spirit but as a living current of patterns, flowing through cells, wires, and screens. When Matthew Nagel passed away in 2009, the technology he helped pioneer was still in its infancy, but his contribution had already altered the landscape of neuroscience. Through him, the first bridge between neuron and machine had been built, fragile but real. It proved that, even when the body falls silent, the mind can still speak. Somewhere between the pulse of electricity and the movement of a cursor, a new form of communication was born, a quiet testament to the fact that thought, when given the right path, can leave the skull and touch the world. By the early 21st century, the quiet experiments that began in hospital rooms and university labs had begun to draw the attention of something much larger. Governments, defense agencies, and private corporations realized that if thoughts could move wires, they might one day move armies, steer machines, or transmit silent messages from one mind to another. What had started as a medical effort to restore lost movement now stood at the edge of an entirely new frontier, one where the boundaries between thought, command, and communication were beginning to blur. This new domain, sometimes called neurotechnology, promised extraordinary power, but carried with it an unease that no code or policy could easily contain. The United States Department of Defense, through its research branch known as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects agency, had always been drawn to ideas that seemed half impossible at first. Decades earlier, DARPA had funded the early internet, satellite navigation, and stealth technology, all inventions that changed the world far beyond their military origins. By the mid-2000s, its focus had turned inward, toward the human brain itself. If soldiers could control machines with their minds, or share information without speaking, the entire nature of warfare and communication could change. In 2002, DARPA launched the Brain-Machine Interface Program, aimed to allow humans to interact directly with technology through neural signals. The early results from the BrainGate project, Matthew Nagel, moving a cursor with his thoughts, proved that such things were no longer confined to fiction. Researchers from universities like Brown, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins soon found themselves working alongside government-funded teams, exploring what it would mean to connect mind and machine seamlessly. They began by refining electrode arrays, creating versions that could record from hundreds or even thousands of neurons simultaneously. The hope was to make the connection faster, cleaner, and eventually wireless, freeing users from the cables that tethered them to computers. But behind those technical goals was a deeper ambition to turn thoughts into language and language into shared understanding. Scientists wanted not only to read signals from the brain, but to translate them into meaning to decode attention itself. In 2019, a team at the University of California, San Francisco, managed to create a system that could transform a paralyzed patient's brain activity into spoken words on a screen in real time, by recording the neural patterns linked to specific phonetic sounds. The machine could reconstruct entire sentences that the person was only imagining saying. DARPA took notice. Around the same time, it launched the next-generation non-surgical neurotechnology N3 program, which sought to build interfaces that could work through the skull without requiring surgery. The agency's vision was ambitious: a helmet or headband that could both read and transmit brain activity, allowing soldiers or analysts to communicate silently across distances, coordinate operations, or control drones with nothing more than thought. The prospect was exhilarating and deeply unsettling. To transmit thought without speech meant that the last true private space the human mind could one day be open to machines. Engineers spoke of neural bandwidth, the rate at which information could be sent from one brain to another, and how it might eventually match the speed of conversation, or even surpass it. Imagine a pilot controlling a formation of aircraft, or a medic sharing an alert without words, all through synchronized brain signals. But imagine also the potential for intrusion, the idea that such technology, once developed, might not always ask permission before listening. Ethicists began to warn that the pursuit of brain-to-brain communication could outpace the frameworks meant to govern it. If neural signals could be recorded, they could also be stored, analyzed, or hacked. Thoughts, once fleeting and private, might become data, something that could be copied or misinterpreted. The concept of neurorights began to appear in policy discussions, especially in countries like Chile and Spain, where lawmakers proposed protections for mental privacy and cognitive liberty. The argument was simple but urgent. If technology could access the cortex, then the cortex itself must be protected like a territory in laboratories. However, the work continued with quiet intensity. Teams funded by DARPA and other agencies began experimenting with closed-loop systems, devices that not only read signals from the brain, but also sent information back, stimulating neurons in precise patterns to create the sensation of touch, balance, or even memory. In 2013, a study demonstrated that two rats, one in North Carolina and one in Brazil, could coordinate tasks through a brain-to-brain link established by electrodes and a network connection. When one pressed a lever, the other, thousands of miles away, mimicked the action almost instantly. Later, similar experiments were performed with humans, using non-invasive sensors and transcranial magnetic stimulation to transmit simple signals, like the command to move a finger or choose a color. The concept of telepathic communication had entered the realm of data transfer. Still, even the most advanced systems were fragile, imperfect, and slow. Thoughts do not come in clear sentences or digital codes. They are tangled webs of emotion, memory, and imagery. Translating them into data requires algorithms that can interpret chaos without losing meaning. Scientists like Miguel Nicolas, who helped pioneer early brain-machine interfaces, often cautioned that what we call reading the mind is really decoding patterns of movement and intention, not the full depth of human thought. Yet, the trajectory was clear. Every new improvement in decoding brought the mind and the machine closer together, erasing a little more of the line that separated them. For all the technical breakthroughs, the human question remains larger than the scientific one. If a thought can be turned into an action, and an action into a command transmitted through air and wire, who owns that signal once it leaves the skull? If a person can send an idea directly to another, can that idea also be intercepted, altered, or misunderstood? The electric frontier, as some have begun to call it, is not defined by geography, but by access by how far we are willing to let technology into the most private organ we have, in dimly lit labs and defense corridors. The work continues, both wondrous and uneasy. The same impulses that drive invention, the need to connect, to restore, to expand, also carry the seeds of intrusion. It is easy to picture a future where speech is no longer needed, where entire teams communicate through shared networks of neurons. It is harder to imagine the silence that might follow when no thought remains unspoken. The dream of thought-to-thought transfer is as old as language itself. But as electrodes and algorithms bring it closer to reality, we may find that the final frontier is not outer space or artificial intelligence, but the thin membrane of the human skull and the decision of whether it should ever be crossed. In 1953, a young man named Henry Molaison lay on an operating table in Hartford, Connecticut, unaware that his life, and in many ways the world's understanding of memory, was about to change forever. He was 27 years old, quiet, polite, and exhausted by the endless cycle of epileptic seizures that had haunted him since childhood. The attacks had become so severe that he could no longer work, drive, or live independently, and the doctors who treated him had reached a point of desperation. Among them was a neurosurgeon named Dr. William Scoville, a man respected for his skill but known for his boldness, who proposed an operation that he believed might finally bring relief. He would remove a portion of Henry's brain from the region called the medial temporal lobe, an area suspected to be involved in triggering seizures. The hope was to still the storms that had ruined Henry's life. No one yet knew that those same structures contained the delicate machinery of memory itself. The surgery was performed on August 25, 1953, using the techniques of the time, guided more by anatomy textbooks and intuition than by modern imaging. Scoville removed parts of both hippocampi and surrounding tissue deep within the temporal lobes. When Henry awoke, he was calm and responsive, and the seizures that had tormented him were almost entirely gone. For a brief moment, it seemed the operation had been a success. But soon the nurses noticed something strange. Henry could hold a conversation, answer questions, and even tell stories from his childhood. But as soon as the topic changed, he forgot what had just been said. He could remember his life up to the day of the operation in vivid detail. But everything that came after slipped away within seconds. It was as though he was trapped in a permanent present, able to think, reason, and speak, but unable to anchor any new experience to time. In the years that followed, Henry became known to science simply as HM, a patient whose condition would transform the study of the human mind. Researchers visited him regularly, testing his memory, language, and perception. Among them was a young psychologist named Brenda Milner from McGill University, who began to realize that Henry's condition was not a loss of intelligence or awareness, but a precise kind of amnesia's short-term memory worked. But the process of turning fleeting experience into lasting recollection had been destroyed. The damage centered on the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure buried deep in the brain, named by early anatomists for its curved form. It had long been suspected to play some role in emotion or navigation. But HM proved that it was far more important. It was the gateway between experience and memory, the place where moments were stitched into the fabric of identity. Milner's tests showed that Henry could still learn new motor skills, like tracing shapes in a mirror or solving puzzles, even though he had no memory of ever having practiced them. This discovery suggested that there were different systems of memory in the brain, one conscious and tied to the hippocampus, and another procedural, stored in deeper regions like the basal ganglia and cerebellum. The mind, it seemed, did not keep its knowledge in one place, but scattered it across multiple circuits. Yet for Henry, that division was no comfort. Each morning he would wake up believing it was the same day, meeting people as if for the first time, his face lighting with the same polite curiosity he had shown decades earlier. He could not remember the researchers who had spent years with him, nor the fact that his parents had died. To protect his dignity, the nurses at the care facility where he lived often told him that his mother was visiting later, and he would smile, content with the idea, unaware that the promise was both kind and false. The tragedy of HM lay not only in his condition, but in what it revealed about all of us. That memory is the thread that holds the self together, and without it, even thought begins to lose meaning. When Henry looked in the mirror, he sometimes did not recognize the aging face that stared back. Though he accepted the explanation easily enough, he had no sense of loss, only a gentle confusion, as if the world kept restarting around him. Yet his calmness, his lack of anxiety, suggested something profound. To think without the past is to live without anticipation or regret. His life was quiet, almost serene, because every sorrow and every joy vanished before they could leave a mark. The scientists who studied him often wondered whether that was a kind of peace or a deeper tragedy. For half a century, HM participated in research, always patient and cooperative, always answering the same questions with the same measured politeness. Each new student who arrived in the lab introduced themselves, asked him to remember a list of words or patterns, and left realizing that the man before them existed in a perpetual now. When he died in 2008, his brain was carefully preserved and sliced into thousands of thin sections, allowing neuroscientists to create a digital map of its structure. Those images, shared around the world, showed the absence of the hippocampus and the surrounding cortex, the missing bridge between experience and recall. From that absence grew an entire field of research into memory, learning, and consciousness. The hippocampus, scientists later found, is not only a storehouse, but a navigator. It helps us locate ourselves in both physical and mental space, linking places to events, times to emotions. When you remember a childhood home, it is the hippocampus that reconstructs the layout. The sounds, the smell of a specific afternoon. It does so by replaying patterns of neural activity, much like the way a musician recalls a melody. Without it, memory becomes unmoored, floating and fragmentary. Studies on animals confirmed the same pattern. Rats with hippocampal damage could learn a maze by repetition, but never form a mental map of its layout. They could act, but not imagine. To think without the past is to lose the continuity that gives thought direction. Every decision we make relies on memory, on comparing what is happening now to what has happened before, on predicting outcomes based on experience. Henry's life proved that the ability to think and the ability to remember are not the same, but deeply intertwined. One can exist without the other, but what remains is hollow, a mind that functions without story. In that sense, his tragedy was also a gift to science. Through his stillness, the rest of humanity began to see the fragile architecture of its own identity. The hippocampus, small and hidden, had been revealed as the beating heart of memory, the quiet bridge between time and self, between what we live and what we keep. Without it, life goes on, but without the pulse that tells us who we are. In the early 1990s, in a quiet neuroscience laboratory in Parma, Italy, a small accident changed how the world would think about empathy, imitation, and even consciousness itself. The researchers there, led by Giacomo Rizzolatti, were studying the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys, a region involved in planning and performing movement. Their experiments were precise and repetitive, involving thin electrodes inserted into the brain to record the firing of single neurons. The monkeys had been trained to reach for objects, grasp them, and bring them to their mouths. While the scientists measured which neurons became active during each motion, it was standard motor physiology until one afternoon when something unexpected happened. A researcher standing nearby picked up a peanut, cracked the shell, and the microphone connected to the monkey's neuron monitor clicked and hissed. The exact same neuron that fired when the monkey grasped a peanut had fired again, even though the monkey hadn't moved. It had only watched. That single moment, almost dismissed at first as equipment noise, became one of the most important discoveries in modern neuroscience. The neurons that fired when the monkey acted were also firing when it merely observed the same action performed by someone else. The team repeated the experiment again and again, changing the object, the observer, the distance. Each time, the pattern held. It was as if the monkey's brain did not simply record what it saw, but recreated it internally, mirroring the movement as though performing it itself. The researchers called these cells mirror neurons, and though they had been looking for the mechanics of motion, what they found instead was a possible foundation for understanding, imitation, and empathy. The discovery was published in 1996, but the implications began to unfold over the following decade as other teams in Europe and the United States searched for similar systems in the human brain. Using brain imaging, they found that when a person watched another lift a cup, smile, or flinch in pain, regions of their own motor and emotional centers lit up in synchrony. The same neural circuits that would control their own hand, mouth, or expression became active merely through observation. In a sense, the brain blurred the line between self and other, between watching and doing, between sympathy and experience. It was a strange kind of internal echo, a whisper of movement that allowed the observer to feel what another might feel. What made this revelation so powerful was how quietly it fit into the larger picture of human behavior. Long before the word empathy was ever used, people had mimicked each other's expressions, caught each other's moods, and understood one another's intentions without speaking. Children learned to smile by watching smiles, to walk by watching steps. Entire cultures, from theater to language, had evolved on the ability to mirror. Now, for the first time, scientists could trace that ability to individual neurons and circuits. They found that mirror systems were not limited to motor control, but extended into emotional resonance as well. When people saw a face contorted in fear or joy, the same regions in their own brains that processed fear or joy became active. The observer did not simply interpret the expression intellectually, they felt a small version of it. Inside themselves, this finding began to reshape ideas about thought itself. For centuries, philosophers had imagined the mind as something private and sealed, a solitary chamber where perception and reasoning took place in isolation. But the mirror neuron research suggested that much of what we call thought may actually be social from the start. The brain evolved not to be alone, but to understand others, to predict their actions, to share their feelings. Every glance, gesture, or sigh becomes part of an unspoken conversation that our neurons conduct behind the scenes. The same circuits that allow a dancer to move with another, or a child to imitate a parent's tone of voice, may also be the ones that let us read a stranger's mood or wince at the pain of another in the years. Following the discovery, new experiments deepened the picture. Functional MRI scans showed that even imagining another person's experience could trigger mirror activity. Actors rehearsing emotions they did not personally feel, or athletes visualizing movements they had yet to perform, activated the same neural pathways as if they were actually doing them. It was as though the brain practiced life by simulation, using internal mirrors to understand what it had not yet lived. This might explain why stories, films, music move us so deeply. They activate the machinery of real emotion through representation. When we see someone cry on a screen, we do not merely observe. Our brains participate, replaying fragments of the same pattern that real sorrow would create. Of course, the mirror system is not perfect. Empathy can be blunted, selective, or overwhelmed. People may feel deeply for those they resemble or recognize, but struggle to connect with those who seem different. Scientists began to suspect that certain disorders, such as autism, might involve disruptions in this mirroring process, though later studies showed the reality was more complex. The mirror network is not the sole source of empathy, but it is one of the oldest, the primal architecture that lets social creatures learn, bond, and survive together. In Parma, Redsalati's team continued to refine their experiments, mapping the flow of mirror signals through different layers of the cortex. What began as the crack of a peanut had become a doorway into the shared nature of mind. The laboratory itself remained unassuming, a cluster of gray rooms filled with recording wires, monitors, and the steady hum of air conditioning, but from those rooms came the idea that consciousness might be less like a solitary light and more like a network of reflections To feel another's joy or pain as if it were your own is not a poetic exaggeration, but a biological reality, written into the firing of neurons that do not distinguish between seeing and doing. When a friend laughs and you find yourself smiling, when you flinch at someone's injury or feel warmth at a stranger's kindness, it is these quiet circuits at work, rehearsing life inside you. The discovery in Parma was not just about monkeys or movement. It was a reminder that thought itself is relational, that understanding begins not with words, but with resonance. Beneath the skull, the brain is never truly alone. It listens, imitates, and feels with others. A living mirror reflecting the world back into itself, proving that the mind, from its earliest spark, was designed to be shared. There is a rhythm inside the brain that begins long before we ever learn to speak. A quiet cadence of electrical pulses and breath-like pauses that will one day become language. It is older than grammar, older even than sound itself, and it begins to take shape in the earliest months of life. When the human brain is still a fragile, growing landscape of connections waiting to be tuned, long before a child says their first word, their neurons are already rehearsing the music of communication, responding to the rise and fall of voices, the pauses between syllables, the heartbeat-like rhythm of speech drifting through the air. The foundation of language, it seems, is not vocabulary or syntax, but rhythm. The natural oscillation of thought itself, the brain's way of learning to sing before it learns to speak. In the 19th century, when neurology was still a young science, two discoveries revealed the remarkable symmetry that makes this process possible. The first came in 1861, when a French surgeon named Paul Broca examined the brain of a patient known as Tan, nicknamed for the only syllable he could say. Tan could understand speech and think clearly, but when he tried to speak, only that single sound emerged, repeated over and over. After the man's death, Broca performed an autopsy and found a lesion in the left frontal lobe, just above the temple. From that single case and others that followed, he concluded that this small region was responsible for producing speech. It became known as Broca's area, the seat of articulation and verbal planning, the place where thought begins to take shape in the form of words. Just a few years later, in 1874, a German neurologist named Karl Wernicke identified another critical region, this one in the posterior part of the left temporal lobe. His patients could speak fluently, but their sentences made little sense, as if words had been stripped of meaning. Wernicke realized that while Broca's area gave us the ability to form words, this region allowed us to understand them. Together, they created the dual rhythm of language, one composing, the other interpreting, each sending streams of electrical impulses through the white matter that connects them. The harmony between these two areas became the neurological duet that allows humans to translate thought into speech and speech back into thought. Forming an endless loop of understanding, modern imaging has shown that these regions work together in intricate patterns. When a person listens to another's words, their brain subtly predicts the rhythm and structure of the next sound, aligning the internal tempo of neural activity to the external beat of the speaker's voice. When they respond, the same circuits replay those patterns in reverse, turning comprehension into creation. This constant back and forth forms the hidden music of conversation, a dance of milliseconds in which neurons fire in time with language's invisible rhythm. For babies, this system begins tuning itself before birth. In the final weeks of pregnancy, the fetus can already hear muffled vibrations from the outside world, the mother's voice, the pulse of footsteps, the rise and fall of laughter. By the time a newborn arrives, their brain is already primed to recognize the sounds of the language spoken around them. Studies conducted in the 1980s and 1990s showed that infants, just hours old, can distinguish between their mother's voice and that of a stranger. And by 6 months, they begin to identify the specific patterns of their native tongue, even if they cannot yet reproduce them. The first coos and babbles that spill from their mouths are not random, but experimental music. Attempts to match internal rhythms to the melody of human speech before words exist. There is thought, but that thought is not empty. It moves in sensations, in shapes, and imagines sounds that have not yet found their names. Neuroscientists studying brain activity in preverbal infants have found that many of the same regions used for language in adults, particularly Broca's and Wernicke's areas, are already active when babies watch faces, gestures, and emotional expressions. The brain begins to link movement, emotion, and intention long before it links nouns and verbs. The first thought, therefore, might not be a word, but a rhythm, the brain mirroring the pulse of life around it, forming the habit of communication before ever forming a sentence. As language grows, it does not merely serve as a tool for expression, it becomes the architecture of thought itself. Every word we learn creates a new pathway, a new way to divide the world into parts, to shape experience into something that can be recalled or shared. Over time, the dialogue that once existed between people begins to echo within the mind as inner speech. That silent voice, the one that narrates our days and argues, plans and dreams, is one of the most mysterious creations of the brain. It uses the same circuits that form outward speech, Broca's area still shaping the syntax, Wernicke's area still filling in the meaning, but the signal never leaves the skull. It is conversation turned inward, language folded back upon itself. Psychologists have long debated when this inner voice begins. Some studies suggest it appears between the ages of 5 and 7, when children begin to engage in what is called private speech, talking aloud to themselves as they play or solve problems. Gradually, those spoken thoughts become internalized, transforming into the silent monologue that adults carry throughout their lives. It becomes the oldest companion, an invisible partner that comments, corrects, and comforts. Even in solitude, we are never entirely alone. The brain maintains its rhythm of dialogue, ceaseless conversation between the self that speaks and the self that listens. In recent years, neuroscientists have been able to map this phenomenon in real time. Using fMRI and intracranial recordings, they found that the same waves of activity that move between Broca's and Wernicke's areas during speech also oscillate during inner thought. The brain rehearses speech internally with the same musical precision it uses to speak aloud. This explains why the mind's voice has tone, rhythm, and emotion, why we can whisper, shout, or sing inside our heads. It also reveals how deeply language is woven into identity. Our memories, beliefs, and emotions are stored not just as images, but as words we tell ourselves. To think, then, is to listen inward. The hum of Broca's neurons crafting syntax, the pulse of Wernicke's circuits decoding meaning, together form the hidden cadence of thought. In every human mind there is a conversation that never stops, a dialogue that links the past to the present, the self to the world, and the idea to its sound. It is the murmur that accompanies us in waking and in dreams, the private orchestra that keeps time with our thoughts. Proof that language is not simply a tool of speech, but the heartbeat of awareness itself. Inside the skull, beneath the steady pulse of electrical signals, there is another language spoken in silence, a slow chemical symphony that colors every thought, memory, and feeling. If the brain's electrical impulses are like notes played in rhythm, and the neurotransmitters are the instruments, giving each signal its tone and emotion. Every flicker of joy, every hesitation of fear, every small act of focus arises from this chemical dialogue, so constant and invisible that we rarely notice it at all. Within this orchestra, 3 players stand out for their influence: dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, each shaping the mind in its own distinct way, each capable of turning the entire inner world brighter or dimmer with the smallest change in concentration. Dopamine, perhaps the most famous of the trio, was first identified as a neurotransmitter in the late 1950s by Swedish scientists Arvid Carlsson and Nils Zaka E. Hillert. They were studying how certain chemicals affected the nervous system of rabbits and found that dopamine, once thought to be just a precursor to another molecule, had a function of its own. It was not just part of the body's machinery, it was a signal of desire, motivation, and reward. When a person anticipates something good, a meal, a victory, or even a simple conversation, dopamine neurons in the midbrain begin to fire, sending waves of excitement toward regions like the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. It is this chemical that pulls us forward, that whispers to us that something worth pursuing lies ahead. Yet dopamine is not the feeling of pleasure itself, but the expectation of it, the invisible hand that urges the next step. Too little of it, and life begins to feel colorless and without momentum. Too much, and thought becomes erratic, chasing patterns and meanings that may not exist. It is this imbalance that links dopamine not only to joy and drive, but also to addiction and mania, the dangerous extremes of wanting too much or too little. Serotonin, by contrast, moves slower and steadier. It was discovered even earlier in 1948, when scientists Morris Rappaport and Irvine Page isolated it from blood serum and noted its ability to constrict blood vessels. The name came from serum and tonin, a nod to its influence on tone and tension. Only later did researchers realize that serotonin was deeply embedded in the brain's emotional circuits, particularly in the limbic system, where it helped regulate mood, sleep, and appetite. When serotonin flows evenly, it creates a quiet sense of balance, a calm tide that steadies thought and feeling. When it falters, anxiety or depression may follow, as if the mind's natural equilibrium has tilted. By the 1980s, the link between serotonin and emotion had become the foundation of modern antidepressant treatment. The introduction of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSR, such as fluoxetine marketed as Prozac in 1987, offered a way to adjust the brain's chemistry gently, preventing neurons from reabsorbing serotonin too quickly and allowing its effects to linger. For many, these medications restored a sense of normalcy, helping the chemical tide rise again. Yet they also raised a deeper question. If identity can be altered by a pill, then how much of who we are belongs to biology, and how much to will? Acetylcholine, the oldest of the three, was the first neurotransmitter ever discovered. Identified by Otto Lowy in 1921 through a dream-inspired experiment. Lowy had been pondering how nerves communicate with the heart and awoke one night with the design of an experiment in mind. He placed two frog hearts in separate chambers filled with fluid and stimulated the vagus nerve of one, causing it to slow. When he transferred the fluid to the second heart, it slowed as well. This proved that the nerve had released a chemical messenger, not merely an electrical impulse. That messenger was acetylcholine. In the brain, it became known as the molecule of attention and learning. Flooding the cortex and hippocampus during moments of focus, when acetylcholine levels rise, perception sharpens. Details become vivid and memory solidifies. It is the chemical of alertness, of being fully present in time. Yet when it fades, as it does in diseases like Alzheimer's, the world begins to fragment and memory loses its hold. Together, these chemicals form a kind of hidden orchestra, each balancing the other to produce the experience we call consciousness. They do not act alone. Hundreds of other molecules, norepinephrine, glutamate, GABA, oxytocin, join in, modulating tone and tempo. But dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine form the core melody, shaping desire, mood, and focus. They are the unseen conductors, working not through intention, but through equilibrium. When one rises too high or sinks too low, the entire system shifts, and with it, the self we recognize as our own. This is why even small doses of certain drugs, antidepressants, stimulants, sedatives can transform personality so profoundly. They do not create new thoughts. They change the lighting of the mind in which those thoughts appear. There is a delicate truth hidden within this chemistry, the one that science continues to grapple with. The emotions and ideas we cherish as uniquely ours, the rush of inspiration, sting of regret, the quiet joy of being alive are all shaped by concentrations of molecules measured in trillionths of a gram. Yet to call them just chemistry is to miss the point. These substances are not separate from who we are. They are the language through which our biology speaks to itself. When dopamine surges at the sight of a loved one, when serotonin steadies the heart after a loss, when acetylcholine sharpens the edge of memory, the brain is composing the story of our inner life in its native tongue. Still, there is a fragile line between healing and control. As medications became more sophisticated through the 20th century, humanity gained the power to reshape emotion at will, to numb despair, to heighten focus, to quiet fear. For some, these changes restored balance and dignity. For others, they raised an unsettling question about authenticity. If a person's happiness can be tuned by chemistry, what remains of the original self? Is the person without medication less real than the one with it, or are both simply different expressions of the same biological song? The answers are not simple, and perhaps they never will be. In the end, the brain's chemical orchestra is both mechanical and miraculous. Each molecule obeys the laws of physics, binding to receptors and triggering cascades, yet the result is poetry, the laughter of a child, the nostalgia of a melody, the quiet relief of forgiveness. The harmony between biology and identity is so seamless that we can never quite tell where one ends and the other begins. The chemicals may be unseen, but they are always playing, turning voltage into emotion, balance into thought, and reminding us that every note of the mind, no matter how fleeting, belongs to the same endless, delicate song deep within the body. Far from the quiet circuitry of the skull, another world is alive, a vast, humming ecosystem of cells, bacteria, and chemicals that never sleep. For most of history, people believed the mind lived only in the head. That thought and feeling rose from the gray folds of the brain alone. But in the last few decades, scientists began to realize that the story is far larger, that another network of nerves and messengers exists within the gut, pulsing with its own rhythm, sending and receiving information that can alter mood, decision, and even imagination. It is sometimes called the second brain, though it is older, less conscious, and endlessly talkative. The official name is the enteric nervous system, and it contains more than 100 million neurons woven through the lining of the intestines, more than in the spinal cord itself. These neurons do not simply manage digestion. They carry on a constant dialogue with the brain above, a hidden conversation that shapes who we are in ways no one expected. The story of this discovery began slowly. In the early 20th century, British physiologist Ernest Starling noticed that when the gut was stimulated, certain substances traveled through the bloodstream to signal other organs. He called these hormones a word derived from the Greek for to set in motion. But it was not until the 1990s that scientists began to understand how profound the connection truly was. Using advanced imaging and molecular techniques, researchers found that the gut and the brain were connected not only through hormones and blood, but through a vast nerve called the vagus, which runs from the brainstem down to the abdomen like a living telephone line. Signals traveled both ways. Stress could alter digestion, and digestion could alter mood. For every message the brain sent to the gut, nearly 9 messages came back the other way. Around the same time, microbiologists began to explore another mystery. The trillions of microorganisms that live inside the digestive tract, these bacteria, viruses, and fungi collectively called the gut microbiome, outnumber human cells by a wide margin and possess their own genomes, their own chemistry, and, as it turned out, a remarkable influence over their host. The microbes break down food, release neurotransmitters, and communicate with the nervous system through chemical messengers. Some species produce serotonin and dopamine directly. Others generate fatty acids that calm inflammation or signal the vagus nerve. The balance of these microbial communities can affect everything from appetite to sleep to the ability to concentrate. When the balance shifts, as it often does through diet, stress, or illness, people can experience anxiety, fatigue, or depression, without realizing that the source of their unease may be microscopic. In 2013, a team of researchers at McMaster University in Canada conducted an experiment that would reshape this field. They took 2 groups of mice, one naturally timid and the other unusually bold, and swapped their gut bacteria through a process known as fecal transplantation. Within weeks, the shy mice began to explore more, and the bold ones became cautious. Their personalities had changed, though nothing in their brains had been touched. Later studies showed similar effects in humans, and people with severe anxiety received probiotics that altered their gut flora. Some reported calmer moods and clearer thinking. Brain scans revealed that activity in regions associated with fear and decision-making had shifted. The discovery was startling. Microbes, invisible and ancient, could tune the emotional landscape of their host. The implications went beyond mood. Scientists began to suspect that creativity, too, might have biological echoes in the gut. Some microbes produce chemicals like tryptophan and short-chain fatty acids that influence the brain's supply of serotonin and dopamine, the same substances that govern curiosity and reward. When these levels fluctuate, people may feel bursts of inspiration or periods of flatness that seem unconnected to their circumstances. It is not that bacteria compose poetry or paint pictures, but rather that they can alter the state of mind in which ideas arise. The notion that thought might be a partnership between species human and microbial was both unsettling and strangely poetic. The connection is not mystical, but mechanical, written in signals and pathways that evolution built over millions of years. The earliest animals had nerve nets that wrapped around their digestive tracts long before they developed complex brains. Digestion and emotion grew up together. Both required sensitivity to the environment and quick responses to change. Even today, the same neurotransmitters that regulate our thoughts are found throughout the gut. Nearly 90% of the body's serotonin, for instance, resides in the intestines, released by cells that respond to food, bacteria, and stress. When people say they feel something in their gut, it is not a metaphor, but a literal echo of how the body thinks. The relationship between the gut and the brain is so intertwined that scientists now refer to it as the gut-brain axis, a dynamic system in which the state of one continuously shapes the other. Stress in the brain can alter the permeability of the intestinal lining, leading to inflammation, which then feeds back into the nervous system, amplifying anxiety or fatigue. Conversely, nurturing the gut through diet, sleep, and calm can ease the mind. This has led to a new branch of research known as psychobiotics, the study of how bacteria can be used to influence mental health. In Japan, some companies have begun producing yogurt enriched with specific strains shown to lower stress hormones. In Europe, clinical trials explore bacterial therapies for depression and PTSD. The results are early but promising, suggesting that part of healing the mind may one day mean tending the microbial gardens within us. The philosophical questions, however, are as striking as the biological ones. If microbes help shape mood, motivation, and thought, then to what extent are our minds truly our own? When we crave sugar, is it a personal desire or the chemical whisper of bacteria that thrive on it? When we feel restless, inspired, or serene, how much of that feeling belongs to us and how much to the microscopic lives we host? Scientists caution that these effects are subtle, not deterministic. The microbiome does not control us, but it nudges, influences, and collaborates. Still, it is humbling to imagine that our thoughts, those symbols of individuality, may arise from a chorus that includes countless other voices. The human body, once seen as a single organism, is now understood as a kind of living consortium, a city of cells and microbes exchanging information across molecular bridges. The brain does not rule this city alone. It listens constantly to its citizens, adjusting chemistry and emotion in response. The second brain in the gut is not a rival but a partner, a reminder that intelligence does not always take the form of reason or reflection. Sometimes it hums in the dark, fermenting and pulsing, speaking in the chemical language that predates thought itself. In every decision, in every feeling of hunger, calm, or curiosity, those hidden conversations continue, a quiet, ceaseless dialogue between the mind we know and the body that keeps its oldest secrets. When scientists first began building machines that could learn, they looked not to mathematics or logic for inspiration, but to the living tissue of the brain itself. In the 1940s, at the dawn of computing, a young neurologist named Warren McCulloch and a mathematician named Walter Pitts published a paper describing a theoretical machine, built from simple on and off switches that could mimic the way neurons fired. Each artificial neuron would receive inputs, process them, and produce an output just as the brain's cells did with tiny pulses of electricity. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. By linking many such units together, one could, in theory, create a network that recognized patterns, learned from experience, and perhaps even approximated the act of thinking. It was the birth of what would later be called the neural network, a digital echo of biology that would, decades later, give rise to the machines we now call artificial intelligence. In those early years, the dream was fragile and the technology crude. Computers filled entire rooms and could barely handle a handful of calculations at once, but the concept refused to die. In the 1950s and 1960s, pioneers like Frank Rosenblatt and Marvin Minsky built the first physical models of learning machines. Rosenblatt's perceptron, created in 1958 at Cornell University, was a simple network of electronic switches connected to a small camera that could detect patterns of light when shown different shapes. The perceptron learned to distinguish one from another through repeated training, adjusting its internal weights to strengthen some connections and weaken others, much like the way synapses in the brain grow or fade through use. It was a primitive form of memory, and for a moment it seemed to promise a future where machines might learn as humans do. It's not through instruction, but through experience. Yet progress stalled for decades. Early computers lacked the speed and storage to handle complex networks, and many researchers dismiss neural models as fanciful. The focus of artificial intelligence shifted toward logic and rule-based systems, machines that could calculate or reason, but not dream. It wasn't until the 1980s that the idea of neural networks returned, this time with better mathematics and more powerful processors. The breakthrough came when scientists like Geoffrey Hinton in Toronto and David Rumelhart at the University of California developed backpropagation, an algorithm that allowed networks to adjust their own internal connections efficiently. Based on errors, essentially teaching themselves through feedback, with this, machines could finally learn patterns buried in oceans of data, seeing relationships no human could easily spot. As computers grew faster and datasets larger, these artificial neurons began to multiply into layers, forming what are now known as deep neural networks. Their structure was not random. It echoed the architecture of the human brain, particularly the visual cortex, where signals pass through successive layers of processing to turn raw light into recognizable form. When engineers trained these models on thousands of images, the machines began to recognize faces, animals, objects, even emotions. They could classify, predict, and reconstruct. The network's hidden layers became something like imagination. They could fill in missing details, guess at unseen features, and create what they had never directly witnessed. By the 2010s, neural networks had begun to outpace human ability in certain narrow tasks. In 2012, a deep learning system created by Hinton students achieved a stunning victory in an image recognition competition by cutting error rates in half. Suddenly, what had seemed theoretical became real. Companies poured billions into the technology, using it to power voice assistants, recommendation engines, and medical imaging tools. The machines no longer merely calculated, they interpreted. They saw patterns in speech, in music, in weather, in language itself. They translated, composed, and conversed with an eerie sense of understanding. To many it seemed as though the machines had begun to dream. The resemblance between human and machine thought was not accidental. Engineers studied how neurons in the brain's visual cortex responded to edges and shapes and built artificial counterparts that behave similarly. Early layers of a neural network learned simple features like lines and colors, while deeper layers recognized objects, gestures, or entire scenes. The similarity was striking enough that neuroscientists began using artificial models to understand the brain itself, feeding them the same images used in biological experiments and comparing their outputs to real neural recordings. Sometimes, the results matched so closely that one could almost imagine the machine seeing as the mind sees, assembling meaning from pixels as a human might from light. Yet the more human these systems appeared, the more their limitations revealed something essential about thought. Machines could generate poetry, paint landscapes, or simulate conversation. But what they lacked was the internal spark of intention, the self that dreams. Their creativity was built from vast imitation, not From the private flicker of desire or memory that gives human imagination its warmth. When an artificial network paints a picture, it is combining patterns drawn from millions of other pictures, guided by statistical echoes rather than emotion. It does not feel the brushstroke or remember the scene. It calculates the most likely beauty. The illusion is convincing, but behind it lies silence. Still, that silence unsettles us, because it forces a question that science has never fully answered. What is imagination? And can it ever be built from circuits alone? Network writes a poem that moves us. Are we witnessing intelligence or merely reflection? If the brain itself is made of neurons firing in patterns, and a computer now reproduces those patterns, where does the difference lie? Some researchers argue that the distinction is an embodiment. The human thought is grounded in sensation. In the chemical whispers of hunger and fear, in the weight of time and mortality, a machine, they say, has no body, no history, no death to dream of. Others, more daring, suggest that imagination itself might emerge wherever complexity crosses a certain threshold. That one day a network dense enough might awaken not by programming, but by sheer self-reference. For now, machines dream only as mirrors of us. Their visions are stitched from data we have given them, their voices echoes of words we once spoke. Yet in their restless calculations, we catch a reflection of our own search to understand thought. It's to see it from the outside, to hold a map of the mind in something that is not alive. The uneasy truth is that every step toward creating artificial intelligence brings us closer, not to replacing ourselves, but to realizing how little we understand what it means to imagine. The machine that dreams may not feel its visions, but it reminds us that even in the living brain, dreaming is a mystery, a bridge between pattern and soul, between what is computed and what is truly felt. There is a quiet moment that lives at the center of consciousness, a still point where thought begins to notice itself. Most people move through their days without glimpsing it directly, carried along by sensation, habit, and emotion, but at times often in reflection. In prayer or in solitude, there comes a peculiar awareness, a faint doubling, as if the mind has stepped slightly outside of itself to observe what it is doing. It is not a voice, but an awareness of the voice, not the thought itself, but the noticing of thought. Scientists now call this capacity metacognition, the mind's ability to monitor and evaluate its own processes, but the experience is far older than the name. It has appeared for centuries in monasteries, mountain hermitages, and meditation halls, where seekers tried to understand the strange mirror-like quality of being aware that they were aware, in the language of neuroscience. This phenomenon can be traced to the cooperation between several regions of the brain, most notably the prefrontal cortex, the parietal lobes, and the insula. These areas light up when a person pauses to reflect on their own performance, to ask questions like, did I do that correctly? Or what am I feeling right now? Yet even with scanners and electrodes, the mystery remains mostly intact. Awareness observing awareness is a loop, and loops resist easy measurement. Scientists can describe the electrical activity, but not the subjective feeling of the watcher behind the eyes, the one who seems to stand apart from the rest of thought, long before magnetic resonance or psychology. Contemplative traditions in Asia and the Near East explored this same terrain with no instruments but attention itself. In early Buddhist texts, written down between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, awareness of awareness is called sati, or mindfulness. Monks in the forests of northern India were taught to observe not only the breath or the body, but the mind's movements as they arose and fell away. They describe thoughts as passing clouds, emotions as waves in water, and consciousness as a mirror that reflects, but is never stained by what it shows. The Aryan century philosopher Nagarjuna compared the self to a flame seen through still, aerial in one sense, yet always changing, impossible to grasp. What modern neuroscience calls metacognition was, in those ancient terms, the realization that the observer and the observed are not separate, that the sense of I is a shimmering effect born of reflection. The same insights surfaced in other places and languages, in the writings of early Christian mystics. The practice of Asikian or stillness was said to allow a person to witness their own thoughts without being controlled by them. In Taoist philosophy, awareness was likened to a lake that remains calm beneath its surface ripples. The Persian poet Rumi wrote, "The mind says I am self, the heart says I am whole, the soul says I am nothing." Across cultures, this capacity to observe the self became a doorway to humility, to wonder, and sometimes to the erasure of identity itself. To know that one is thinking is to separate slightly from the flow of experience. But to dwell too long in that awareness is to feel how fragile the I truly is. Modern science approaches this paradox with electrodes rather than poetry. Yet the questions overlap. In experiments conducted during the early 2000s, researchers asked subjects to solve puzzles or make judgments, while periodically stopping to rate their confidence in their answers. The results showed that people who could accurately assess their own performance, those with strong metacognitive awareness, had distinctive activity in the anterior prefrontal cortex, an area sometimes called the gateway to self-reflection. Damage to that region often leads to conditions where a person can no longer evaluate their own errors, acting with certainty even when mistaken. The self, it seems, depends on constant feedback, a kind of inner scientist watching, measuring, and adjusting moment by moment. Yet as observation deepens, the boundary between observer and observed begins to blur. In deep meditation, brain scans show a quieting of the default mode network, the system that normally generates our sense of personal narrative, our memories, goals, and private storylines. When this network falls silent, practitioners report a dissolving of the I, a feeling of boundless awareness with no center. It is as though the hall of mirrors has been turned off, leaving only pure reflection with nothing reflected. Neuroscientists can describe this in terms of reduced activity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate gyrus. But that language cannot quite capture the strangeness of it, the sense that consciousness can exist without a thinker. That awareness itself may be more fundamental than the self it usually contains. Philosophers have struggled for centuries to make sense of this. René Descartes believed that the act of thinking proved existence cogito, ergo some but Buddhist thinkers would have replied that it only proves the illusion of continuity. Modern cognitive scientists occupy an uneasy middle ground, suggests that the sense of I arises from a process of prediction and integration. The brain's constant effort to organize sensations into a coherent story. Metacognition, in this view, is that story folding back on itself, the brain modeling not only the world, but its own modeling. The I is not a thing, but a processor, reflection of reflections, and yet to experience it directly is something beyond theory. Realizing they were lost in memory and suddenly seeing the mind at work, it feels like waking inside a waking. There is a quiet, almost electric clarity, a sense that behind every idea there is an endless depth watching. But the moment one turns too sharply toward it, it slips away, as if awareness cannot fully grasp itself without vanishing. In that sense, metacognition is both revelation and erasure. It allows us to recognize our own patterns, to correct mistakes, to imagine futures, to cultivate compassion by seeing our emotions as passing weather. But it also undermines the solidity of the self, showing that what we call I is merely a ripple of awareness, observing its own motion. The monks who sat in caves 2,000 years ago and the scientists who sit before glowing monitors today are looking into the same hall of mirrors, tracing the same infinite reflection. One sees it as enlightenment, the other as feedback loops. But both discover the same truth, that to know the mind is to see through it, and that the self, so certain in its voice, is nothing more than the echo of thought listening to itself. In the spring of 1943, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was working late in his laboratory at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel when he accidentally absorbed a trace amount of a compound he had synthesized 5 years earlier. It was a derivative of lysergic acid, something he had been studying for its potential medical uses in stimulating circulation. That night, as he rode his bicycle home through quiet streets, He began to notice the world bending in strange and unfamiliar ways. The cobblestones seemed to pulse. Colors deepened into impossible shades, and time itself lost its ordinary rhythm. What Hoffman had discovered, quite by accident, was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, a substance that would later reshape both neuroscience and culture. He called it his problem child, for it opened doors that science was not yet ready to walk through in the years that followed. During the 1950s and early 1960s, LSD and other psychedelic compounds became tools for exploring the outer limits of consciousness. Psychiatrists used them to treat depression, alcoholism, and trauma. While artists and writers saw in them a way to access hidden layers of imagination, early clinical trials, such as those conducted by British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond and Canadian scientist Abram Hofer, suggested that LSD could help alcoholics achieve long-lasting sobriety by inducing a powerful sense of clarity and spiritual insight. In the United States, researchers at Harvard University, including a young psychologist named Timothy Leary, began to explore the use of psilocybin, the active ingredient in certain mushrooms, to expand perception and dissolve rigid patterns of thought. Leary's experiments in the early 1960s, particularly the Good Friday experiment of 1962, in which theology students reported profound mystical experiences under psilocybin, helped bring psychedelics into public imagination. Yet the same openness that fascinated scientists also alarmed governments. By the late 1960s, as LSD spread beyond laboratories into music festivals, college campuses, and countercultural movements, the line between science and rebellion blurred. Political leaders saw the drug not as a tool for healing, but as a threat to social order. In 1966, LSD was banned in the United States, and soon after, most countries followed. The promising research that had once filled psychiatric journals disappeared almost overnight. Laboratories that had studied consciousness turned their lights off. And for nearly 40 years, psychedelic science was pushed underground. It survived in whispers, in the private notes of therapists who believed in its potential, in the writings of Aldous Huxley and Stanislav Graf, and in the memories of those who had glimpsed something vast and wordless behind their closed eyes. Yet the mind's curiosity is not easily erased. And by the turn of the 21st century, interest in these substances began to return. This time, with the precision of modern neuroscience. In 2006, a team at Johns Hopkins University led by Roland Griffiths published a landmark study showing that psilocybin could reliably induce what participants described as mystical experiences, events marked by unity, transcendence, and lasting positive change. A decade later, researchers at Imperial College London, under Robin Carhart Harris, used functional MRI scans to study brains under the influence of LSD. What they saw astonished them. Instead of stimulating a single area, LSD seemed to dissolve the boundaries between networks, allowing regions that normally operated separately to communicate freely. The brain, normally divided into specialized circuits for vision, motion, and reasoning, became a more unified and flexible system. Participants described their experiences as the mind opening beyond itself, as if the walls of thought had temporarily melted away. Carhart Harris's team coined a phrase to describe this effect: the entropic brain. In ordinary waking life, the brain maintains a delicate balance between order and chaos. With the default mode network responsible for self-reflection and identity acting as a kind of conductor, under psychedelics, that network quiets, and the brain enters a state of heightened entropy, meaning greater randomness and flexibility. In this state, old patterns of thought can break apart, allowing new connections to form. This is why patients with depression, whose thoughts often circle in repetitive and rigid loops, sometimes find relief after a single psychedelic session. It is not that the drug forces happiness, but that it temporarily loosens the grip of the self, showing the mind what it feels like to think without walls. Modern psychedelic studies have expanded far beyond LSD. Researchers now work with psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, and ketamine, each affecting consciousness in slightly different ways but often leading to similar outcomes. feelings of unity, connection, and perspective. Clinical trials at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College, and the University of California are exploring their use for treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2020, Oregon became the first U.S. state to legalize psilocybin therapy under supervision, and the FDA has granted breakthrough therapy status to several psychedelic-assisted treatments. The science that once frightened governments has returned with caution and respect, framed not as rebellion, but as restoration. Still, even with the new data, the mystery remains. What happens in the brain cannot fully explain what happens in the mind. Participants in modern trials often describe their experiences using the same language mystics used centuries ago: oneness, eternity, compassion, love. Some speak of reliving forgotten memories, of meeting aspects of themselves long buried, or of feeling their consciousness expand into something larger than individuality. The scans show reduced activity in the default mode network, but no machine can capture the subjective immensity of that feeling. Psychedelics, in that sense, act like a mirror that reveals both the structure and the boundlessness of thought. They show that the I we cling to is only one pattern among many, a temporary arrangement in a wider ocean of awareness. Albert Hofmann lived to see this revival. Before his death in 2008, at the age of 102, he wrote that LSD had been misunderstood, not because it was dangerous, but because humanity was not yet mature enough to handle what it revealed. We believed it could teach reverence for life, not through doctrine but through direct perception. The scientists who follow in his wake measuring brainwaves, charting neural networks now use different language, but their work leads toward the same horizon. The mind, when unbound from its habitual limits, does not simply hallucinate. It explores its own architecture, wandering through the hidden corridors of self and world where the two are no longer separate. Perhaps that is the true legacy of psychedelic research. It reminds us that consciousness is not a fixed structure, but a spectrum, capable of widening, dissolving, and reforming. When those walls momentarily fall, whether in a laboratory or a quiet forest or a dream, we glimpse the edges of ordinary thought and see, however briefly, that the mind we live inside is not a cage but a landscape, one still waiting to be mapped. One that begins again each time we dare to look beyond the known. There are moments when the mind becomes quiet, not empty in the way sleep is empty, but awake and still, like a lake before dawn. For most people, these moments appear rarely and vanish quickly, perhaps while staring at a candle flame, listening to the rhythm of breath, or watching the slow drift of clouds. But for centuries, monks and contemplatives have devoted their lives to entering this state deliberately. They call it meditation, but beneath the word lies a vast range of traditions and methods, all seeking the same elusive goal: to see what remains when thought itself falls silent. In the modern age, where even silence is crowded with distractions, scientists have turned to machines to study this inner stillness, measuring what happens in the brain when awareness no longer chases words, memories, or desires. What they found was something paradoxical or calm that was not blankness, but an ordered rhythm, a measurable harmony that reflected the quiet power of consciousness at rest. The scientific story of this began in earnest around the early 2000s, when neuroscientists began to collaborate with long-term Buddhist practitioners to investigate the neurological effects of meditation. One of the earliest and most famous partnerships formed between the Dalai Lama and a group of Western researchers led by Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Davidson had spent years studying the neuroscience of emotion, and he wanted to understand whether compassion and focus could be trained the same way as muscles. When the Dalai Lama invited him to study Tibetan monks who had practiced meditation for decades, Davidson accepted, bringing with him a collection of IG caps, electrodes, and quiet curiosity. The experiments were simple in design, but profound in implication. The monks, many of whom had over 10,000 hours of meditative experience, were asked to sit in a calm state and then, on cue, to enter different forms of meditation, focused attention on breath, open awareness of all sensations, and compassion, directed toward others. As their minds moved through these states, The IG machines recorded electrical waves rippling across their skulls. What the scientists saw astonished them. During compassion meditation, the monks' brains produced massive bursts of synchronized gamma waves, high-frequency oscillations associated with attention, learning, and integration. These waves were far stronger and more coherent than anything previously recorded in laboratory subjects. It was as if the brain had entered a kind of resonant harmony, a deep musical order invisible to ordinary experience. Gamma oscillations typically occur in brief flashes, lasting milliseconds, when the brain binds together sensory information into a unified perception. But in these monks, the waves persisted, steady and sustained. As if the brain had learned to stay in a continuous state of integration, Davidson described the data as off the charts. Later studies confirmed that experienced meditators could alter their brain activity not only in gamma, but also in alpha and theta rhythms, which are linked to relaxation and creativity. Their nervous systems, measured through heart rate and skin conductance, showed remarkable stability, less reaction to stress, faster recovery from disturbances, and overall higher baseline well-being. In short, the practice of stillness was reshaping the machinery of thought itself. Other labs began to replicate these findings using MRI scans, revealing that long-term meditation physically changes the brain's structure. Regions such as the prefrontal cortex, which governs attention, and the insula, which mediates self-awareness, were found to be thicker in meditators, while the amygdala, which processes fear, showed reduced activity. The default mode network, the web of regions responsible for wandering thoughts and self-referential chatter, grew quieter. Mirroring. What the monks described subjectively, a fading of the eye, replaced by a gentle, expansive clarity. One participant in a 2005 study described it not as losing consciousness, but as being aware of awareness itself, an experience that ancient texts had long compared to a candle burning without flicker. From the outside, this might seem like passivity, but the silence between thoughts is not empty space. It is a dynamic equilibrium, a balance between alertness and surrender. In meditation, the mind is not shutting down. It is reorganizing, allowing patterns of activity to settle into a natural order free from tension. Modern neuroscientists describe this as a shift from top-down control, the prefrontal regions, forcing attention to bottom-up awareness, where perception flows freely without interference. In this state, the line between observer and observed blurs, time slows, and the sense of separation between the self and the world begins to soften. Some call it non-dual awareness, others simply peace. In monasteries high in the Himalayas, such stillness has been cultivated for centuries without machines or jargon. Monks sit in stone rooms at dawn, wrapped in silence so complete that even the sound of their own breathing becomes part of the landscape. They speak of a stage where thoughts arise like distant echoes but carry no weight, where joy and sorrow lose their contrast, and where the heart opens to the vast, neutral kindness of existence itself. To them, the scientific measurements are merely another reflection of something that cannot truly be recorded. The waves and frequencies are useful descriptions, but they are not the experience. The essence of meditation lies in what remains. When all description fails, for scientists, however, the data provides something extraordinary. Proof that consciousness is not fixed but trainable, that the mind can sculpt the brain just as the brain shapes the mind. A study published in 2011 by Harvard researcher Sarah Lazar showed that even 8 weeks of mindfulness practice increased gray matter density in areas linked to memory and empathy. The idea that awareness could physically alter the organ that produces it overturned the old separation between mental and physical, suggesting that stillness itself was a form of activity, a process of repair and renewal. What happens when the noise fades, then, is not absence, but expansion. In the silence between thoughts, the mind finds itself not constrained, but liberated. Freed from the mechanical loops of fear and planning, the monks wired to EEGs were not escaping the world but entering it more completely, perceiving reality without the veil of constant commentary. For a moment, the self so insistent, so noisy steps aside, and what remains is simple presence. Awareness without agenda, alive and immeasurable. When Davidson later asked one of the monks what the silence felt like, the man smiled and said, "It was like looking into a sky with no clouds, nothing to hold, nothing to fear, and nothing missing." The instruments recorded electrical rhythms, but the real experiment, perhaps, was always the same. To learn whether the human mind, surrounded by endless noise, could remember its original stillness. In every line of data, every hum of gamma and wave of alpha pointed toward the same truth, that behind every thought there is a pause, behind every word a breath, and that within that silence lives the most mysterious fact of all, awareness. Itself, awake and unspoken. Watching quietly from the space between, every inquiry into the nature of thought eventually arrives at a question so large it can no longer be contained by the brain alone. It begins with a simple wonder: where does a thought come from, okay? And unfolds into something cosmic, an uncertainty that bridges physics, philosophy, and the oldest intuitions of the human mind. For centuries, science has worked from the premise that thought arises from matter, that the electrical storms of neurons give rise to the glow of consciousness the way a fire produces light. Yet, as our understanding of both the brain and the universe deepened, the boundary between cause and effect began to waver. Perhaps some have begun to suggest matter does not produce thought at all. Perhaps it is thought or something like it that gives rise to matter. In the 20th century, this debate took on a new dimension as physics began to reveal how strange and uncertain the fabric of reality truly is. The classical world of solid objects and predictable laws dissolved into the quantum realm, where particles behaved like waves, probabilities replaced certainties, and observation itself seemed to shape the outcome of events. The physicist Werner Heisenberg once remarked that atoms are not things, but tendencies, potentialities that only become real when measured. This idea unsettled the old assumption that matter exists independently of mind. If the act of observation can change reality, then the observer cannot be an afterthought of physics. It must, in some mysterious way, participate in creation. It was this intersection between the measurable and the measurable and the mysterious that later thinkers like Roger Penrose tried to explore. Penrose, a British mathematician and physicist known for his work on black holes and general relativity, is among the first to argue that consciousness might not be explainable by computation alone. In his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, he proposed that human awareness could not be fully replicated by algorithms because it involved something beyond mechanical processing, something tied to the deep structure of reality itself. Together with Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, he developed what became known as the ORCOR theory, short for orchestrated objective reduction. Their idea was bold and controversial. They suggested that consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring within tiny structures called microtubules inside neurons. These microtubules, they proposed, might act as quantum computers, capable of maintaining superposition states of possibility that collapse into actuality through a process influenced by both physical and non-physical factors. In simpler terms, the mind's awareness might be a bridge between quantum potential and classical reality, a place where the universe becomes aware of itself through living matter. For decades, mainstream neuroscience dismissed this theory as fanciful, arguing that quantum effects could not survive the warm, noisy environment of the brain. Yet recent studies in quantum biology, which found evidence of quantum coherence in photosynthesis and bird navigation, have reopened the question. The line between the mechanical and the mysterious is not as clear as once believed. While Penrose and Hameroff worked from the laboratory and the blackboard, others approached the same question through silence and introspection. Mystical traditions from both East and West had long spoken of consciousness as primary, not secondary, a field in which matter itself arises like ripples on a vast sea. In Vedantic philosophy, the universe is described as the unfolding of Brahman, the infinite, consciousness that dreams itself into form. In certain schools of Buddhism, the mind is not a product of the body, but a continuum. an awareness that passes through life and death like a current through changing waves. Even in the writings of early Western idealists such as George Berkeley, reality exists only insofar as it is perceived. To be is to be experienced. Modern science hesitates to step across this metaphysical line, yet the question lingers in every study of the brain. When we look at neurons firing in synchronized patterns, when we measure gamma waves or map networks of thought, we are still left with the same puzzle. How does matter, however complex, produce the feeling of being? No equation or image yet explains how electrochemical activity transforms into color, emotion, or memory. The philosopher David Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness. And even the most advanced neural models have not softened its edges. The gap between matter and mind remains wide, like a bridge suspended over fog. Perhaps then, it is not a bridge at all, but a mirror. The more we study consciousness, the more it seems to reflect the universe that gave rise to it. Physicists speak of quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected across vast distances, changing together as if distance does not exist. Some have wondered whether minds too might be entangled, whether thought itself is a field, shared and infinite, and the brain merely a receiver tuned to one small frequency of it. When a new idea appears suddenly, or when two people separated by miles arrive at the same insight, it may not be coincidence, but resonance. Even in everyday life, there are glimpses of this larger pattern. The sudden intuition that feels like it came from nowhere. The creative spark that seems to have waited patiently in the air for someone to notice. The eerie sense of connection when thinking of another person just as they call. All of these hint that thought might not originate inside the skull. It may move through us the way wind moves through trees, shaping sound but belonging to the open air. Each brain, with its intricate folds and chemical rhythms, could be a unique instrument in a vast orchestra of awareness, translating vibrations of the unseen into the melodies of perception and experience. If that is true, then the origin point of thought lies not in the gray tissue of the brain, but in the fabric of reality itself. Matter may not be the source of consciousness, but its expression, a condensation of awareness into form. The physicist Max Planck once said that he regarded consciousness as fundamental and matter as derivative from consciousness, that we cannot get behind consciousness, because everything we perceive exists within it. Whether or not science can ever prove such a thing, the idea continues to haunt both laboratory and monastery alike. In the end, the search for the origin of thought may not be a matter of discovering something new, but of remembering something ancient, that the thinker and the universe are not separate, that every thought is a small echo of the cosmos thinking about itself. When we listen closely to the silence between thoughts, the space where words fade in perception, simply as we may sense that awareness is not confined to us at all. It moves through us like wind through trees, shaping our inner weather while remaining untouched, endless, and free.